Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald. Welcome back to a new episode of System Update here on our home on Rumble. And I'm excited to be joined by a guest as part of our burgeoning series to try and explore what, whether you like it or not, is going to be a very consequential debate surrounding Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, a debate that involves not just questions of economics, but politics and culture, issues of free speech and how people communicate and organized. And I'm joined today by Alex Gladstein, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation, as well as the Oslo Freedom Forum. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm delighted to. I'm excited to. I think you've become, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, somewhat of a guru for a lot of people on questions of Bitcoin, which I think highlights a dynamic that I want to begin with, which I think is become a little bit of a problem in terms of trying to draw more people into this discussion,
hmm
which is people hear Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and the like, and they kind of repel. It's something that seems like it's a huge learning curve to participate in, to start to understand. So there's this kind of tiny group of people who are very knowledgeable about everything involving crypto and Bitcoin. And then there's a huge rest of us who have struggled, I think, to try and both understand what the basics are that we need to know to participate in the discussion and also why we should care enough to try. So, for people who haven't yet made that effort, or for people who have made that effort and haven't yet gotten a grasp enough of to convince themselves that they should continue to go further, just take a few minutes to explain from your perspective what people ought to know about Bitcoin in terms of what they need in order to understand it as an entrance way, and why they should care enough to try.
Sure. So I think to start, it's important to understand that money is broken for billions of people around the world. It doesn't work as well as it might if you live in the United States or in Europe, and kind of in two ways. First of all, a lot of people live in countries that have really poor currencies. I mean, a lot of people are looking at what's happening in Turkey right now. But the fact is that about 1.6 billion people live under currency regimes which have double or triple or even quadruple digit inflation. And it's hard for them to access dollars or euros or yen or currencies that are considered reserve currencies, right? That other central banks would actually want to save. There's also the issue of hundreds of millions of people lacking banking services, living behind sanctions, and being unable to actually easily or cheaply send and receive money either to clients or family abroad. So the idea that like you're an American, you can save in the stock market, you can buy real estate, you can use Venmo, like this is a very privileged existence. Only essentially about 13% of the world's population lives in a country that has both a reserve currency. Again, we're talking the dollar, the euro, the yen, the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, the British pound, etc., and property rights and sort of liberal democracy. So the other 87%, live under either a poor currency or a more kind of authoritarian regime. And for those people, they're turning to Bitcoin as kind of an alternative. It has performed extremely well over the last decade, and it gives them an ability to connect more recently with something that we might get into briefly called the Lightning Network, an ability to connect very very cheaply and instantly uh, in terms of transactions with anyone around the world. So that's the driving force behind global adoption. Is it's just a better alternative to what a lot of people have.
It's interesting to me that pitch you just made about why Bitcoin is appealing, why people ought to look at it in a positive light and see it as promising is, and I hate to use these crude political labels, but it seems pretty clear to me that it sounds like something that would appeal more to somebody who sees the world through a left wing prism than a white right wing prism. And yet, it is an odd dynamic, at least to me, that when you raise the possibility of Bitcoin or crypto as a political cause or even as just a currency issue to rally around, the hostility that's provoked is found much more on the left than on the right. There's almost like this reflexive hostility toward it. And I want to get to that in a minute. But for
Hmm.
people who don't see the world through this kind of traditional left wing perspective, but who actually just look at the world as kind of a citizen of the West and say, okay, I hope the people who live in those other places that you're talking about experiencing crippling inflation or who are living under authoritarianism find a way out of that. But here in the United States, we actually have enough problems of our own. I have enough problems of my own. I'm struggling to support my family. And even though I might be privileged relative to other people, I want my political leaders to focus on my welfare, not theirs. And I want to focus on my political interest and not theirs. Eh, and in fact, some of people who think that way might actually say, I like the fact that the United States has a privileged position and that Americans have a privileged
Sure.
position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. I want that to continue. What do you tell people like that who I think probably represent, it sounds like a very nationalist way of thinking. I think there's at least a bulk of the citizenry in the United States and Western countries that think that way, if not the majority. What do you tell them about why they ought to view Bitcoin as a promising technology rather than as a menacing one?
Sure. And look, I'm a beneficiary of the kind of dollar hegemonic system for sure. I'm someone who benefited from kind of the dollar as the reserve currency. Not all Americans did. You had to be kind of on the coastal elite in a sense. If you were kind of in the manufacturing sector, in blue collar industries, the dollar being the reserve currency was not great for you over the last several decades. But as far as like why it would matter for anybody, here's a couple reasons. So even if you're in Germany or in New York or California, um, there are a couple things happening in terms of the digitalization of money that are very concerning. I think we want to just focus on three things quickly: surveillance, central bank digital currencies, and deplatforming. So these three things are should be of chief concern to anybody, regardless of whether you live in China or the United States. Um, when the United States started to formulate its laws around financial privacy in the 1970s, we didn't have electronic money in the same way we have today. But even still, if you look at the court cases back then, when the Supreme Court was basically formulating or allowing what is now sort of the Bank Secrecy Act, the dissenting judges were very clear eyed about what could happen, and that in terms of um, you know third party financial companies being obliged to give information about their customers to the government, and that was in a world where people used a lot of cash and paper checks. That was before we had like swiping and tapping, etc. And they were basically like really concerned about where that would lead. Well, fast forward several decades. I mean, every time you make a transaction, you reveal an enormous amount about of yourself to third parties, right? Now that tends to be more of like a surveillance capitalist kind of outcome in the United States. It tends to be more of like a kind of an authoritarian, sort of digital authoritarian outcome in China. But in either case, there are third parties, whether they be corporate or state, that are like kind of learning more about you than you know about yourself, and they're starting to be able to socially engineer you, and they can indeed turn off your services and deplatform you. I mean, anyone who uses Venmo, anytime you send a Venmo payment, the thing that comes up says, this may or may not be frozen, essentially. So I think in a
Yeah, and
world
I
where
mean, I
like,
think like
yeah,
one of
go
the
ahead.
most disturbing examples recently is PayPal announced that it was partnering with the Anti-Defamation League, which a lot of people traditionally viewed as this kind of benevolent organization, but has certainly become, if they weren't always, a highly political organization to create lists of what they call extremists that PayPal will then deny the ability to use financial services. And it goes back actually to what the government did to WikiLeaks in 2010 and 2011 in the wake of those disclosures. The US government, with no due process, no charges, pressured banks, Amazon, Bank of America, MasterCard, Visa, PayPal, to just simply remove WikiLeaks from the world of financial services to prevent them from being able to collect donations. So there's kind of the question of privacy, the ability to track
Hmm.
what people are doing in the current system, but also this power that governments and financial centers have to just remove people from the financial institution as punishment for political dissent or for whatever other arbitrary reasons they might have.
Yeah, I mean, look, the money that we use on a daily basis is evolving from a bearer instrument that provides privacy and freedom to a mechanism of control and surveillance. I mean, that's what's happening. And the cypherpunks knew this. So the cypherpunks were the activists who helped create encryption, peer-to-peer encryption in the 80s and 90s. And what's worth noting is that digital cash was kind of their holy grail. I mean, that was kind of what their final goal was to create a way of doing anonymous, private, parallel to the state transactions on the internet. They fought first and foremost for privacy in communications, and that's why we have things like PGP and Signal today. But if you go back and read their writings in the 90s, especially, you'll see that their big goal was kind of this idea of digital cash. And again, for citizens in America, why should you care? I don't live in Lebanon or whatever, right? You have a lot of financial privilege, fine. Um, the fact is that Bitcoin functions as both digital cash. It is that digital cash where you can operate outside of the system that eventually will start to discriminate against people who have totally reasonable opinions. And B, it's digital gold. And even in the United States, even in the reserve currency, we've got 6% inflation. And a lot of Americans don't have access to the stock market, or they don't have enough capital to buy real estate. Well, guess what? They can buy a couple dollars of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has destroyed just factually any other investment class over the last decade, and it's completely open to anybody. So I think both from a savings aspect in terms of wages versus rising costs everywhere else, in addition to the sort of idea of like, how do we reduce the big brother surveillance capitalist monster? It's helpful in both cases, I would say. So I think it's helpful for everybody, in a big way.
So I want to delve into those three rationale that you just gave about why Bitcoin would be beneficial, not just to people living in authoritarian governments or economically developing ones, but people here in the West. Obviously, there's a lot of concern in the United States about the ability for big tech to police our discourse, control our discourse, gather data about us, understand us, as you said, better than we understand ourselves. I want to ask you about some of those rationale. But before we do, the last person that I interviewed about Bitcoin and crypto was someone who uses the moniker Bitcoin socialist. And
Hmm.
as his name suggests, I invited him on specifically to make the left wing case to left wing skeptics about why they ought to care. And we kind of walk through in a very, I would say, basic way what his arguments were. And I noticed a lot of people still saying, look, I listened to this 60-minute or 70 or 80-minute discussion, however long it was, and I still don't
Hmm.
really know what Bitcoin is, what you mean by cryptocurrency. So before we get into the specifics of what you think positively will occur if
Hmm.
we embrace this technology or this alternative currency, just explain for people who don't know what it is that you mean. What are you referring to when you talk about Bitcoin? Is it just like a universal currency? Is it something broader than that? And how does it work, like the basics, in a way that operate that makes it different than, say, the dollar or the pound or the euro?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite metaphors for explaining what Bitcoin is it's kind of like email for money. So if we all used to use the postal service, we all shifted to email. We didn't necessarily argue over the politics of email or who it would empower or what were the ideologies of the people who invented email. We eventually all just used email because it was better than going to the post office, right? And I think that's eventually what's going to happen with Bitcoin. Like to me, and I'll explain briefly why it's so obvious to me. It's such a better money than the dollar. I think people will just end up using it and they won't necessarily dwell on its origins or who created it. It'll just be kind of obvious. Um, but it's peer to peer digital cash that allows you to send value to anyone else in the world instantly and for extremely low fee. And it is something that, while it was niche earlier, maybe 7-8 years ago, and it was true that it was niche and in certain communities and wasn't really used worldwide. All of those things were valid criticisms in 2014, 2015. Fair enough. But you have to be Bayesian here, and the world has changed. And there's now hundreds, there's, close to 200 million Bitcoin users. You can swap it in and out of fiat currency in any country in the world very easily and across a number of services. And it's essentially the ultimate bridge for money. Like it connects a Venezuelan to his or her family in the United States. It connects a Cuban to his or her family in the United States. It's something that can do what fiat money cannot do. and that is transcend any sort of political barrier. I think that that's super, super important. The other piece about Bitcoin that you need to understand is that it's kind of ultimately Bitcoin is supposed to be a replacement for central banking. That's kind of what Satoshi, the creator of Bitcoin, wanted, and we know that because in the very first block of what's known as the blockchain, which is just a record of transactions dating back to when Bitcoin was launched, when the software was launched in January of 2009. In that very first block, there's a little Easter egg hidden, which is the headline of a British newspaper from the Sunday Times of London that says "Chancellor on second bailout, on brink of second bailout of banks." So from the very beginning, we saw that Bitcoin wasn't launched in the wake of a surveillance scandal. It was built over time by cypherpunks who cared a lot about privacy. But ultimately, Bitcoin, first and foremost, is not a reaction to surveillance. It's actually a reaction to central banking and to basically the government's, creating a money system where certain people get privileged over others. This is known in economics as the Cantillon effect. But basically, like corporations would get bailed out first at the expense of the taxpayer. And this is really what Satoshi was like challenging with the idea of Bitcoin, where the issuance, meaning the new money coming into the system, would not be dictated by some central banker just arbitrarily clicking it without asking the population, hey, is it okay if I do this? No, it would be algorithmically predictable and set in stone from the beginning so that it's fair for everybody. So we all know, the whole world knows exactly how much Bitcoin will be issued today, tomorrow, in 50 years. That is 100% public, open, and transparent. And that's really what sets Bitcoin apart from any other currency, any other cryptocurrency, any other fiat currency. It's this idea that like nobody controls it and no one's going to get privileged with the creation of new money, and no one's going to get debased. And I think that's where maybe it loses some people because they're like, oh, it's just for buying coffee or something like that. That was like an early meme of Bitcoin. It can do that for sure. I think better than fiat eventually, but that's not why it was created. It wasn't created to buy coffee. It was created to replace the sort of central banking system, that the sort of post 1971 system where our money isn't rooted in something like gold, but is literally rooted, uh, you know, in the decision making of bureaucrats in governments.
As I was preparing to think about what I wanted to ask you, and the challenge for me was kind of narrowing it down to a manageable amount. I saw a tweet from an author who is also a journalist, Vincent Bevins, who wrote
Hmm.
one of the best histories of the Cold War called the Jakarta Method, about how the United States dominated the world through imperialism, through this sort of hegemonic strategy, a lot of which was based in the dollar as the reserve currency. I read an essay of yours as well, linking this model of how the dollar was decoupled from gold, was based on sort of the US as this debtor nation that was infinite. And that's what allowed it to do things like fund endless war in
Hmm.
Vietnam and elsewhere. And one of the things he said is, quote, my big problem with crypto discourse is that the cheerleaders rarely want to acknowledge the difference between the theoretical applications of blockchain technology. Sure, fine, he said, and what is actually happening in the real world with Bitcoin, namely a massive wealth transfer from late to early adopters, meaning that people who bought Bitcoin 10 years ago because they were early adopters
Hmm.
and invested $10,000 are now worth many millions of dollars because of that growth that you referenced earlier, that is destroying any other potential investment vehicle. And it's all because these late investors, people who are only investing in Bitcoin over the last year or so, are driving the price up so wildly that it's turning these early investors into multimillionaires or even close to millionaires, in some cases, probably even billionaires. And that's
Hmm.
the practical effect of it, that the kind of rhetoric is nice, but that's what's really going on. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, so the politics of Bitcoin are fascinating because, like, on a micro level, they appear to be maybe classic liberal or even libertarian, given that it's property rights enshrined in code. Like, if you use Bitcoin correctly, nobody can take your Bitcoin, and that's very, very powerful. But geopolitically, it's more of like you could almost say that it aligns with kind of Marxist or leftist critique of American foreign policy because it's a tool against American dollar hegemony. So I think it's fascinating, and I've relied on a lot of leftist thinkers to help me understand economic history of the world, and I think they are some of the best. Where we disagree is on the solution, really. They don't really have a solution in my view. They don't have one. They don't have a coherent one, at least in my view. And yet, I do think that Bitcoin has a very good chance of becoming the reserve currency of the world eventually. And I think that a lot of people, maybe like Vincent or Michael Hudson or many of these other folks who are kind of like, I don't think so about Bitcoin. I just think they just need to keep digging and keep talking to people. I mean, when you talk to people in these countries and places, and I did a big piece on Palestine this summer, and when you talk to people in Gaza and they're like using this thing, I mean, how can you deny that, right? So I think it's just a matter of like it's so early, and people don't realize there's like tens of millions of individuals in emerging market countries using Bitcoin. Once they kind of figure that out, I mean, you can no longer live in denial, right? That happened to me. I mean, we got exposed to Bitcoin very early at my organization. I think uh, Julian Assange spoke at our second event in 2010, and the next year his colleague came and like had to pay for their tickets in Bitcoin. And then in 2014 we started accepting Bitcoin, but I was still like super super skeptical, as you say. It's like very complicated, right? And it took me personally until 2017 to get really interested in it. So I'm a very
Well, and
skeptical person.
what was that catalyst for you? What was the thing that was your kind of clarifying moment that made you realize that it was something that could really be, I don't know, maybe revolutionary is too grandiose a word, but
Yeah.
something like really significant in a
Look, I
positive
think
light?
it's a kind of a brutal thing, but I think price is the greatest teacher, is something we say, right? That spring, Bitcoin got back up to $1,000, and I was like, fine, maybe I should look at it again. Because look, a lot of people thought it had died or whatever. And then I just started looking at videos from Andreas Antonopoulos, who I think is still like the best person to kind of build a understanding of what Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is. All of his early stuff's so great, and I started to realize that this was a political tool, and this was a political movement that, I mean, could have ramifications similar to what the printing press had with regard to information. Um, really, and for me, what how I learned about Bitcoin was by talking to people in different countries around the world and asking them about money. One of the things I wanted to mention on the show here today is that bizarrely, money has been completely removed from the human rights discourse. Like, you go to human rights conferences, no one ever talks about currency or money, which is so strange because it's so base in terms of like how the world is run. And when you ask someone from a place like obviously Zimbabwe, but even like North Korea or Eritrea or anywhere, you ask them about money, they have amazing stories about money and about how regimes use currency as a tool of control. This is just as true with the United States historically, as it is the French in West Africa, as it is with Israel in the territories, as it is, you, you know, with colonialism, going back as far as you want. Money's always been a tool of power, and yet, for whatever reason, it's been completely removed from today's human rights discourse. I don't think Amnesty International has mentioned Bitcoin a single time in any of their writings. And I think what happened to a lot of people was they got distracted by this kind of blockchain, not Bitcoin kind of thing that happened in 2017, 2018. It really turned off a lot of people. It confused a lot of people. And, you know, I think it's something we need to address. Like, these are different, like crypto and Web3 and all that stuff. It's kind of a different conversation than Bitcoin, and we can have those two different conversations. But Bitcoin is, like, in my mind, absolutely essential for us to understand.
So let me just delve into that a little bit because um I don't know if the day will come when the left realizes how much convergence there is between what they've always said is their political project and what Bitcoin can actually accomplish. That day may never come, and I think in part the hostility on the left is more reflexive than thoughtful in the sense that it got presented in the first instance as a kind of uh, vehicle for libertarian economic theory, right? Like Ron
Hmm.
Paul's
Sure.
hostility to the central bank and fiat money, and it got cast in those terms. Um, but I just want to get a little more practical for a minute
Sure.
about what is on people's minds politically and what is concerning
Yeah.
them politically, not in Eritrea or you know other parts of the world that are developing, which I understand for certain the benefit or potential, at least, of Bitcoin. But for people here in the West, which is the audience which we're essentially going to be addressing once the video is up,
Hmm.
one of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
big concerns is something you alluded to earlier, which is the ability for centralized institutions that wield centralized power to control our political discourse and our political debate, to decide who can participate in that political debate, who can use the internet, who gets deplatformed from the internet, who gets deplatformed from financial services and the like. Why why is it that Bitcoin has the potential to liberate people from that form of oppression and tyranny that they're growing increasingly concerned about? What is it about Bitcoin? How exactly will it work that offers the promise to decentralize that power?
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to censorship and deplatforming, our current monetary and financial structure is controlled by basically third parties that make the decisions on whether or not transactions go through. So this is true about banks. This is true about fintech. This is true about credit card providers. They have the power to freeze and monitor, freeze, and confiscate transactions, and they tell you that's for good, and in some cases it is for good. But it's a huge vulnerability because it can also be used, as we all know, for bad. Just ask anyone who lives in China, right? So I think that what's so critical to understand about the architecture of Bitcoin is it's truly a peer-to-peer system. Like when I send Bitcoin to you, there is no like person or institution in the middle that decides whether or not the transaction should go through. Instead, it's done through a global competition called Bitcoin mining. And this is what is referred to as proof of work, is like the consensus mechanism through which state is achieved in Bitcoin. And to be very simple about it, um, people buy Bitcoin mining equipment, which are these like specialized, basically computers called ASICs, and they expend energy to compete to secure the Bitcoin network, and they are rewarded and incentivized to do so by something called the block reward, which is basically fees that you and I pay. Like anytime you and I send a transaction to each other in Bitcoin, we attach a little bit of a fee. So basically, anytime we want to send Bitcoin, we put into our software that Alex wants to send Glenn some Bitcoin. That goes into a global queue, and then the miners basically scoop up a bunch of transactions that are waiting in the queue, and they do their proof of work. They compete in this global competition. Whichever miner basically solves the puzzle first shows everybody else, and then they get to claim the fees plus the issuance, the new Bitcoin that comes into the system, and the system resets. And this happens every 10 minutes. So, they are competing from a completely self-interested point of view. And, even if the miners are like partially controlled by a particular nation state or company, the other miners don't care. So, we had this for years, this fear of like China, like censoring Bitcoin, right? The crazy part is they never did it. Even though they had at one point like more than half of all the mining equipment in their territory, they were never able to, or never chose to do that. And today, after China kicked out most of the Bitcoin miners, the network is very decentralized in terms of mining. So there's not going to be a situation where like a country can like say, oh, that transaction from Alex to Glenn, don't process that. No, there's going to be miners that are self-interested and don't care about our politics, and they will absolutely process that. We can even incentivize them to do so by making the fee very large. So the system basically is censorship resistant, and that is completely at odds with the existing financial system.
So I wanted that's the part I want to delve into a lot. But before I do, I just want to return to the critique that I read from Vincent
Yeah,
Bevins. And I think it gets to a lot of the opposition, not only on the left, but just kind of in general. It's like a more of an ethos than
yeah.
a concrete or rational argument, which is like it seems sketchy. There's like a kind of Ponzi scheme that people perceive is driving it. And, on the one hand, this critique, I just want to ask about that specific critique
Hmm.
that one of the things that's happening in reality is that the late investors, people being brought into the Bitcoin movement, are making the early investors very wealthy, and therefore it's like a transfer of wealth. I mean, do you acknowledge that that's true? I mean, in
Yeah.
one sense, when I read that, I was actually just talking last week to people about internet billionaires who many of whom I now know more than I ever thought I would. And, some of them are very smart and some of them really aren't. And I think a lot of what happened there is a lot of internet wealth got created not by who was the smartest, but just by kind of who got there first, which probably is what happens with every new industry, with every new technology. There's always a benefit to early arrivers, to early investors. So is your answer to that
Hmm.
specific concern to acknowledge that yes, that is happening for sure, that early investors are getting extremely wealthy due to late investors' new entry, and that's just something that's endemic to every new development, or do you deny that that's taking place?
Yeah, I think we can talk about two concepts: inequality and fairness. So anyone who's telling you that Bitcoin is going to solve, a quality of outcome is lying to you or doesn't know what they're talking about. It doesn't. I don't think any monetary system does. Even UBI, I think, is flawed. What it does solve is a quality of opportunity. This is why I personally am so excited about Bitcoin. The network does not discriminate against you, with regard to the level of your wealth. So, like whether you're a billionaire or a refugee, network doesn't care. That is completely different from the existing financial system, where Jeff Bezos can get like a bailout for his company, and the U.S. government can choose to exclude undocumented migrants from getting bank accounts, et cetera, et cetera. So the current dollar system is hugely exclusionary and discriminates all the time, whether it is against African Americans in the United States, whether it's again in any country, there's going to be haves and have-nots, right? The cool part about Bitcoin is it's the same rules for everybody. And yes, they are very stringent rules. They're strict and basic, but they're strict. But there's no like exceptions, which I think is really amazing. So that's what leads people like me to think it's the fairest money. Satoshi, when they, whoever they were, he, she, they, when they launched Bitcoin, it was completely open. Like they sent an email out. Anybody could mine from the very beginning. There was no like pre-mine. Like there was no he, she. They didn't take a bunch of the 21 million Bitcoin for themselves or for a foundation or for VCs. That didn't happen. Anyone from day one could, if they found it on the internet, which this information was available to anybody who cared to look. They could start mining Bitcoin, and at the time it was 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes, and you could use your laptop to do it basically for the first few years. And I think this is the only chance we actually get it fair money because um, at that time, internet money was seen as like a scientific experiment. No one actually cared about it. For its first year plus, Bitcoin had no economic value. Like had no dollar value. That's impossible to repeat. It was what some people call like the immaculate conception. Like if Glenn and Alex come up with a cryptocurrency today, there's going to be people lined up to try and get some immediately and like get kind of their pound of flesh. So it's not possible to recreate this idea of like an open launch where there's no kind of elites. You can't do that. It was a one-time thing. Thankfully, Satoshi knocked it out of the ballpark. So I think that we need to acknowledge that this is not a income. This is not like a wealth redistribution scheme. It does not solve wealth inequality, and that's important to acknowledge and talk about. But what it does solve is equality of opportunity, and I think it had the fairest launch of any money ever, and it can't discriminate literally. So I think there's a lot of pluses here.
One of the most vocal skeptics, or I would even say opponents of Bitcoin, has become Hillary Clinton. If you notice,
Hmm.
over the last 6 to 9 months in particular, oftentimes she's not even asked about Bitcoin, especially in mainstream media interviews where it's rarely discussed. And she'll go out of her way, almost as a complete non sequitur sometimes, to just bring it up. If she's asked about the threat of Putin or China, and she'll answer that quickly. And then she'll say, and by the way, when we're talking about threats, I want to warn everybody that the threat of Bitcoin is extremely serious and is escalating. And her argument typically is that it can threaten uh, the supremacy of the dollar as the reserve currency, and in doing so, threaten the interests of the United States, by which she means and has always meant kind of the role of the United States as this imperialist superpower that goes around the world ruling the world through power and through force that depends on the model of the dollar as supreme, which Bitcoin threatens. And just
Hmm.
this week, she was joined in this concern by Donald Trump, who, in a somewhat less erudite manner, also said that when asked, he was actually asked about it on Fox
Yeah.
News, said, yeah, I think Bitcoin's really dangerous because what I love is the dollar, and the dollar needs to be strong, and I need the dollar to be strong, and Bitcoin is a threat to that, and therefore I'm against it. I think a lot of people look at that, they see kind of guardians of establishment power, which this version of Donald Trump was, which all versions of Hillary Clinton are. And when they warn that there's a new instrument that can threaten to undermine and subvert status quo power, a lot of people look at that and say, well, that's a pretty good recommendation for it, right? That's a good reason to be interested in it. Looking at it from the perspective of Hillary Clinton and people who are very invested in the prevailing uh, power order of the international system and the like, are they right to be concerned about Bitcoin as this subversive, disruptive instrument, or is that concern from their perspective overblown?
Well, so it depends on who you are, but yes, if you are like,
Like Hillary Clinton, like the standard World
yes,
Bank,
if
IMF,
if
NATO globalist.
if you're part of the like Davos crowd,
Yeah, exactly.
Davos man, if you are, at the European Central Bank or, yes, Bitcoin's going to be hugely disruptive. I believe if it does succeed, I think it'll replace a lot of these functions like the IMF, the World Bank, like a lot of these things will be kind of like emasculated and reduced in power. So yeah, I think it's fair for those people to be debating this and talking about this. I mean, it's kind of crazy they've waited so long, to be honest, in some ways. But for the average American, I think Bitcoin's going to be great for our country. I think a lot about patriotism and Bitcoin, and if you think about the money system we have today, the founding fathers did, and for all their flaws, let's just I'm referring to their positive nature here. They were very skeptical of this sort of monetary system. The current dollar system was essentially kind of like invented in a way by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. So we're talking like Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger on the one side, and then the founding fathers and like Satoshi on the other, right? So I don't buy that like the current system is something that we should defend. I'm very pro-American, but I'm not pro-dollar. And I think that's going to be a point of debate over the coming years. Is like, do people really understand how how kind of screwed up the dollar system is, and how it privileges certain people over others, and how it's forced us to have this massive kind of military presence around the world and all these things? Like, we could do a lot better, in my view. And yes, it will. To answer your question bluntly, it will absolutely disrupt and disempower a lot of the elites, and it may create new ones, but it'll certainly be a threat to the existing power structure, 100%.
It's interesting. I've raised on several occasions in our discussion thus far the left right division and how that plays out in the politics of Bitcoin and the reaction to it. And on some level, I don't want to do that because I don't think those categories are particularly helpful any
Hmm.
longer. I think their relevance is eroding. And one of the obvious ways to me that it has eroded, one of the most encouraging ways is that this model of militarism, imperialism, having permanent uh, military presences in multiple countries around the world, feeding a huge amount of our economy into weapons manufacturers and the military industrial complex. Talk
Hmm.
about wealth transfer every year. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, there was a new $800 billion budget approved by the Congress. Even I think it was like $30 billion more than the Pentagon wanted.
No debate over the
For
inflation that was going to cause, by the
Yeah,
way.
exactly, or where the money comes from, right? It's just automatic. And you have this essay, which I highly recommend everybody read, from last month, called The End of Super Imperialism, where you walk through the history of the dollar, and in particular focus or begin with that 1971 abandonment by Richard Nixon of the gold standard and how it just kind of
Hmm.
became fiat money, and specifically the role that that model plays in ensuring essentially that we remain this country that depends on this state of militarism and imperialism that is no longer just a left-wing cause to oppose, but has become enormously controversial on the right as well. It's one of the things that Donald Trump ran against and won on and
Yeah.
attempted on some level to battle. So talk about uh, kind of the summary of this article. Why is this dollar model of the dollar as the supreme currency, as the reserve currency? So, what is its relationship to militarism and imperialism in the United States? This kind of superpower that rules the world by extremely expensive military force.
Yeah, and look, I tried. I'd love to do that. Just as a preface, I'll hedge briefly by saying that one of the outcomes, of course, of dollar imperialism was the defeat of the Soviet Union. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, um, but it was certainly one of our biggest tools against the Soviets. And I'm very anti-communist, so let's put it that way. I think that's a good
And
thing.
that's the, but then that's Hillary Clinton's argument as well on
Right.
some level too, right? Is like we need the strength of the dollar. It's one of our most important weapons against China.
The problem though is that it became very like kind of mutated and grotesque in my view. It that was almost like a side note of how it changed the world. Um, let's just talk about a couple things briefly. The fiat currency system used to be based on commodity money, essentially on gold. Uh, the nations of Europe went off the gold standard to fight World War One, namely Germany and Britain, and they massively printed huge amounts of money to do so. This put them at a massive disadvantage versus the United States after the 20s and 30s because we didn't have like wrecked economies. We had farms that were intact, we had industries that were intact, and this put us in a hugely positive position going into World War II. And post World War II, that it gave us the ability to basically we had more gold than the other nations, so we were able to dictate terms at the end of World War II in Bretton Woods, which was a conference in New Hampshire that happened in 44 as the war was sort of ending, where all the countries got together and we decided what the fate of the world financial system was going to be. And despite what the British and John Maynard Keynes wanted, which was kind of like an internationally managed currency, the US had enough gold at that point due to its kind of geopolitical kind of happenstance in the last 30 years that we had enough gold to be able to basically tell the other countries what we wanted to do. And what we wanted to do was make everybody else use dollars pegged to gold. So the promise was that you guys should all use dollars all around the world. And when you want to, you can exchange them at a fixed rate for a certain amount of gold. That was set at $35 per ounce of gold. And, the story of the 50s and 60s was the story of that system starting out working okay and then starting to come under pressure as American Cold War foreign policy expanded. And the Korean War was the first time it came under massive stress. And the Vietnam War was the first war we ever fought on credit, essentially, as a nation. And in the 60s, this gold standard completely kind of started to come apart. Nixon going formally off the gold standard in August of 71 was really just kind of like the final chapter. It had kind of informally already happened in the 60s. But essentially, and if you read David Graeber's amazing book Debt, which I do disagree with a lot of it, I think it has an awesome ending chapter where he talks about Vietnam and he talks about why Nixon floated the dollar was to fight the war in Vietnam. So I think you can see the history of the dollar's evolution over time. It's very tied in with militarism, and this was predicted by Immanuel Kant like hundreds of years ago. Like if you could have this globally dominant currency, I mean it's almost like an incentive for more fighting and for more war. And I think that like this we have fun slogans in Bitcoin, right? Like I don't think Bitcoin ends wars. I think that's ridiculous. However, what I do think is it sort of ends this idea of like these forever wars, which the population doesn't know anything about. And again, Kant predicted this if you read some of his essays that like the citizens would essentially become sheep and they wouldn't know what the government was doing. This is really only possible under this like fiat standard. So now we have like I don't know how many wars America's in right now. It's like somewhere between 5 and 8. but like the average American clearly doesn't know that at these exact specifics, and we're kind of fine with it. We kind of walk around, we do our thing. So the war fighting has been completely removed from our power, and that's been largely, I would argue, like a result of this system whereby the control and creation of money has moved 100% into the hands of the government. So Bitcoin threatens that. So I'm hopeful that in the future we won't have such a militaristic foreign policy. I just don't think it's necessary. And in particular, we won't have to prop up the Saudis. I mean, the Saudis and all the horrific things they do and have done across the world have only been, the House of Saud is only around because of the United States and our support for them. And we do that because they price the sale of oil in dollars, and that was a deal we made, a political deal that we made in the 70s with them. And if we don't have to protect that and them anymore, man, that would be a big win for human rights. So I
Well,
think
I
there's a
mean,
lot there, but
yeah, I mean, this is the convergence of left and right foreign policy that I think we've seen that has kind of happened by accident. Is on the one hand, you have the left that has long been against imperialism on moralistic grounds,
yes.
or on the based on the idea that it produces a lot of civilian deaths and it's about dominance, but not for the benefit of ordinary people, but for a tiny sliver of elites who kind of reap all the gains. And then you have the right, especially with Trump's renewal of the America First ideology, which historically has been more isolationist and opposed to military involvement in the world, perhaps for different reasons than the left, but also has come to realize that regardless of the underlying morality, the beneficiaries of this kind of constant desire for global conquest or endless war also doesn't benefit Americans. So, from a nationalistic perspective, it's something that ought to be undermined and weakened. And there is this convergence on the part of, I think, both those parts of the left and those parts of the right,
Hmm.
that this endless war is something which is um, is really at the root of so many of the pathologies that each of those camps sees as the primary target to overcome. Um, so just I want to just press you a little bit more
Hmm.
for that reason
Yeah.
on why it is that the dollar as the reserve currency in the hands of a central bank
Yeah.
fosters that kind of militarism. What is it about that model that that creates unique incentives for those endless wars to continue?
Well, I would say it's two things. Number one, it's specifically our need, post gold, post 71, post the dollar being attached to gold. It's kind of been attached to energy in a way. Like it's kind of again been attached to oil, and that's necessitated a robust amount of military presence in the Middle East. It's not the only reason we're there, but it's a very key reason. And it's a key reason why we've fought numerous wars to defend Saudi Arabia, a ruthless regime, by the way. I mean, we don't even have to talk about the second Iraq war, just look at the first one. I mean, we defend them because, again, OPEC controls 70 to 80% of the world's oil supply. They are like the sort of decision maker in terms of oil and energy. And over the decades, they have had this just agreement between the United States where they price oil sales in dollars, and in return they get like massive amounts of weapons from us and protection from us. And what was key at the beginning was they also had to buy our debt. So the way that the war machine kind of worked was that we were able to get other countries to pay for our wars. First, we were able to get Germany and Japan to pay for Vietnam. This was like in the 60s, 70s, through buying our debt. And then we got the Arab states to buy our debt in the 70s and 80s. And then we got the Japanese to buy our debt in the 80s. And then we got the Chinese to buy our debt. So we found all these other countries to buy our debt, which allowed us to do things which we would have ordinarily not been able to do. So, like, if we didn't have that kind of petrodollar system in place, I don't think we could have like done things like the second Iraq war. It was so expensive to do that. Um, it allowed us to finance this because other countries were willing to underwrite our debt. Now that's starting to change. So other countries are are net negative on U.S. Treasuries since 2013, 2014, meaning they're like just hoarding them. They're not like accumulating. Okay, today the Federal Reserve is the majority buyer of U.S. debt. That's a very different situation than it was 20 years ago. So I would argue that this kind of forever war machine reached its apex in power like maybe 15, 20 years ago, and has been on sort of a slight decline ever since. And that's why you're starting to see today India and Russia starting to do their deals in their own currency. You're starting to see China and India doing deals in their own currency. You're starting to see Europe and Russia starting to do deals potentially in euros or rubles. This is just sort of inevitable. I don't think the dollar could have lasted forever, and I don't think Bitcoin is the thing that like people are going to start to blame Bitcoin for the collapse of the dollar, which is crazy because if Bitcoin didn't exist, the dollar system would still deteriorate. I mean, it's just so unsustainable if you look at how it's built on the back end. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you about the optimistic pictures, the kind of best case scenario or the
Hmm.
better case scenario for what Bitcoin can hope to achieve. And I'll tell you what where part of my skepticism resides.
Sure.
You alluded earlier to encryption,
Hmm.
and I remember very well prior to the Snowden reporting that encryption was something on which privacy advocates and the hacker community and even intelligence agencies were focused as this um solution, a technological solution to prevent governments or non-state actors from invading people's privacy. You do things behind a wall of encryption. It's a mathematical solution that prevents governments from being able to intrude into it. And many of the most impactful Snowden stories we were able to do based on that archive told the story of how the NSA and their Western security allies had found solutions to what were regarded as the most reliable and sophisticated forms of encryption that shocked a lot of people in the privacy community. And obviously, one of the effects of the Snowden story was that people began to develop encryption tools with even greater fervor because there was a much greater awareness of
Hmm.
the need for privacy and the extent to which it was being undermined or imperiled from this surveillance state. And I think what we've seen through other reporting since then is that the government has a much better ability than we typically assume to do things like invade even the kind of end-to-end encryption tools on which WhatsApp and other applications are based. I don't think they've fully managed to invade Signal, but certainly no one thinks it's foolproof. Why won't the same thing happen with Bitcoin, especially as we start seeing these companies emerge where it seems a little centralized? People now buy
Yeah.
Bitcoin through Coinbase and through other companies that make it seem as though this system is more vulnerable both to invasion and surveillance as well as centralized tracking than the kind of triumphalist theories that
Hmm.
originated around Bitcoin initially promised.
Yeah, look, it has to do with incentives. So and architecture of how the currency works. If you look at gold, the way the U.S. government or world governments, let's say, and eventually the U.S. government, the way that they defeated gold or demonetized gold was by centralizing it. First into financial centers after World War One, then into basically the hands of the U.S. government after World War Two. And then once we were able to do that, we were able to kind of demonetize it entirely. And once you have like an asset like that, that's scarce and that can be a good money, once you have it in one place, you can start to like confuse the market by creating tons of paper claims on it. So if you talk to like gold bugs today, they'll tell you that the real fair true price of gold should be something like $10,000 an ounce. It's what, 1,800 right now, and they argue that like because governments and the banking sector have been able to kind of control the bulk of the gold, um, they've been able to like basically rehypothecate or make many more claims than there is gold, and it kind of brings the price down, right? um, that's something that Bitcoin was specifically designed to kind of counteract. So if you one really interesting Easter egg about Satoshi Nakamoto is that they chose a birth date of April 5th, 1973. April 5th is the day when FDR passed Executive Order 6102, which made holding gold illegal in the United States. And 73 was the year when there was a law passed allowing Americans to eventually own gold again. So this idea of like gold being taken away was very much in the mind of the creator of Bitcoin. And the reason why I believe the same fate won't happen to Bitcoin is that there's this powerful culture in Bitcoin of self custodianship. And it is indeed the only thing that will keep Bitcoin from falling the same fate as gold, is that if we all own our own Bitcoin. if we all own it, and this is true today, people own the majority of the Bitcoin, not governments or like large corporations. Even the exchanges don't own a majority of it. And as long as that's the case, the system remains extremely robust. As far as incentives, I think it's kind of interesting because encryption um, is has weaker incentives to use than Bitcoin. I think they're powerful, and it's why even Michael Hayden is now saying it should be every American's right to have encryption. Awesome. It appears that like basically encryption seems to have the culture wars over that seem to have won, and that's going to be normalized into our lives. I think that's good. With regard to Bitcoin, the incentives are different because like it just comes down to human nature and greed. Like these big corporations, they're eventually going to see Bitcoin's performance with clear eyes over time, and they're just going to want some. And this drives up more demand for it, which is like this positive feedback loop: more demand, higher value, more creatives entering the space, better user interface, better UX, all this stuff, like better features. So the demand over time, driven by the fact that no one can print more Bitcoin, it's like the issuance is algorithmically set in stone. That I think over time just creates a positive feedback loop where the thing gets more valuable and more valuable and more people come into it. And I think this is really important because uh, this threat of central bank digital currencies is real. I mean, almost every government in the world is making these things. If Bitcoin didn't exist, kids being born today, they're never going to use paper money. They're all going to use digital money. So their entire decision making would be in the hands of either corporations or governments, which are going to basically replace cash with this thing called the CBDC, which is going to allow them to do easy blacklisting, negative interest rates, expiration dates on money. So, I mean, I would have a very dim view of the world if we didn't have Bitcoin and what we can build on top of it, because things are getting quite scary from that
Yeah, but,
perspective.
but there's just on that point though, I know when I tout the benefits of Bitcoin or crypto
Hmm.
from the perspective of privacy, from not being tracked, from being able to evade state and corporate surveillance,
Hmm.
oftentimes that is what I hear. Well, I'll just use cash. I'll use cash. That seems to be a much easier, more straightforward fix. Seems like, in fact, it's less amenable to being tracked. That on some level, people feel like anything that's done digitally inherently will eventually allow the government to figure out a way to track it and monitor it and find it out. I guess your answer to that, as I just understood, is well, cash is being phased out. But
Yeah.
why isn't then a battle to preserve cash the better solution to advancing a lot of these
Well,
values?
I think we should all be cash advocates. I think cash is an excellent privacy tool. It's a tool for honestly the more vulnerable use it around the world. But the fact is, cash can be demonetized, meaning the government can declare it worthless. And this is what governments do. The Indian government recently declared the largest note completely worthless. Countries like North Korea and Eritrea routinely just sort of declare all the money worthless and make you turn it in for like obviously a massive haircut, and they give you new bills. This sort of happens all the time, and it's just quite clear from trends. If you look at data, the percentage of transactions that are done with paper money and metal money are on the decline, and in some places are almost zero. I mean, it's just very clear that children being born today will never meaningfully use paper money. Um, so in a world that has kind of like corporate money, which is controlled, whether that be kind of like different cryptocurrencies that created by private actors and companies, or whether that be more traditional fintech, and in a world that's going to have these central bank digital currencies, I think we're going to have Bitcoin as this alternative. And to Vincent's point, this is not a hypothetical benefit. Like there are people using this thing today, millions of people using this thing today. This is like the evidence is massive of like humanitarian use, and I think people are just going to have to adjust their opinions accordingly to the facts on the ground.
Yeah, so that's actually gets to what is going to be my last question for
Hmm.
now. I say for now because I definitely intend on dragging you many times back for to make sure that this is an ongoing conversation. I think the more people hearing from someone with your perspective about the vision you have for Bitcoin and the realities of it, the better. But I think if we overload people with too much at once, it'll
Yeah.
have a kind of a diminishing return. So on that last point, the kind of vision that's inspiring is the idea that this can be an a lot of people's hands, that
Yeah.
it's kind of a more autonomous model for doing it. And I was thinking about the fact that one of the most successful left wing politicians over the last, say, 4 or 5 decades, from the perspective of actually bringing huge numbers of people out of poverty, is Lula da Silva, the two-term president in the country where I live in Brazil. And he
Hmm.
talked often about the power of putting just money into people's hands
Hmm.
instead of having it controlled by the government and the like, and the way that that empowers people. So it's a great model. It's a model that has inspired a lot of people, has worked empirically. Just to get back though to what I think Vincent in that tweet and what a lot of other people feel,
Hmm.
is that the vision doesn't match the reality. That Bitcoin is in reality this this currency that has already kind of been commandeered by a very small number of powerful elites. There's probably
Hmm.
Bitcoin billionaires. We know for sure there are, they exist. We don't know necessarily who they are or if they're still alive or what they intend to do with it. But the I think where a lot of the concern and a lot of the reservation comes from is that people feel like they're being lured into a system that promises this kind of more liberating model. And I appreciate that you said that Bitcoin is not going to end wealth inequality or income inequality. Um, but certainly the picture that you're painting is one in which at least some of the more repressive models of currency systems can be ameliorated, but that they're being lured into a model that really is going to not do much more than empower and subject them to the rule of a new
Mm.
Bitcoin elite.
Yeah.
Is that a valid concern? And if it is, what can be done to undermine that?
No, and I think the best book to read to allay your concern on this is it's called The Block Size War, and it's by this guy named Jonathan Beer. And it tells the story of a very important time in Bitcoin history between 2015 and 2017, where a small group of corporations and billionaires tried to hijack Bitcoin. And they failed to do so because Bitcoin is very resilient and it's controlled by its users, not by corporations. And I think this is one of the reasons why I got really pulled into it, was because once I really started to understand the history of the block size wars, I started to realize this thing couldn't really be hijacked. That's not really how it works. Um, I think all of the like skepticism you just aired is entirely valid for all the other cryptocurrencies which are controlled by VCs, small groups of people. We should be on guard against that. Like when you look at these things like Web3, the metaverse, NFTs, a very tiny group of people are disproportionately benefiting from that. In Bitcoin, it's not so much the case. Like every time Bitcoin goes up in price a little, yes, Michael Saylor benefits, but so do like the literally the millions of people in Nigeria who are using it, as opposed to the naira, which has collapsed. And if you think about this, I know there's this kind of left wing frustration with people who were like lucky and who got it 10 years ago. I mean, most you can actually see this in charts. You can chart how Bitcoin moves over time and people visualize it. Like most people who had Bitcoin in 2010 and 11, it's not like they held on to it for 10 years. They like when Bitcoin went from $1 to $30, a lot of people got out, and you can see this
Yeah.
in tweets. And then when it went from $30 to $100, and the number of people who have like literally not touched their Bitcoin from when it was worth less than $100 till today is very, very small. I mean, most, yes, the Winklevi and a few others. It's right. There will absolutely be like new powers, right? Um, but like no one benefits disproportionately. That's the key part. Um, and I think that's something we've never seen before in any fiat money system. And I just two more quick points that I wanted to make, because it's hard
Yep.
for people to understand how Bitcoin will actually like kind of get out into the world and be anything beyond, like in the West, we just kind of see it as a saving instrument, right? Like you're just kind of saving it, right? You're not actually using it. Well, I think what happens is there's like two kind of laws in economics. One is Gresham's law, which describes what I just explained, which is that kind of bad money drives out the good. Like why would I, if I have Bitcoin, why would I use it to buy something at the store when I can just use fiat money, right? So that's kind of like the world where a lot of us are living in. And in that era of Bitcoin, let's say the United States today, most people are going to save. Now, that might be very different in Nigeria or Venezuela, but like let's just say for the listeners here, you're still living in the Gresham's law part. That's going to change eventually. Once merchants don't want your fiat money, once they want your Bitcoin, you're going to have to spend it. So you're already starting to see this in real estate markets. People are selling their homes for Bitcoin. Like eventually, and I don't know whether it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, God knows when, but like the preponderance of merchants and people selling you goods and services, they're gonna place a premium on Bitcoin versus fiat currency. This is already happening in failed states around the world, and it's just going to continue to happen as fiat currency continues to collapse. I mean, if you look at these charts, there's no going backwards. You look at a chart of the dollar versus Bitcoin, like long term, it's not like the dollar is going to make like a comeback. That's not going to happen. So I hope that helps people understand how like long term you might start using it, and it might be more of a kind of actual currency and not just a savings thing. And the last thing I just wanted to end on is like, I think I'd love to just dialogue more with people like Vincent, who I think have more kind of authentic criticisms. But like people like Warren Buffett, I mean, these people are invested in uh, Amazon, Coca-Cola, Boeing, Johnson and Johnson, Exxon and Mobil. I mean, this is not just what the elites are invested in; it's what the average American's invested in. If you look at the S&P, I mean, you look at these like weapons manufacturers and the global soft drink industry, which is poisoning tens of millions of people, and you look at the opioid manufacturers. I mean, that's the store of value for the average American. I just think we can do better, and not just morally, but performance wise. Bitcoin has absolutely crushed the S&P 500, not just this year, but this decade. So I think it's an excellent alternative and an opt out from a system that's totally controlled by people who do not have your best interests at heart.
So, Alex, why don't we go ahead and end here? That's a lot
Hmm.
for people to
Yeah,
digest,
thank you.
including myself. And let me recommend again that everybody read, at least as much as they can of your lengthy essay, "The End of Super Imperialism," which was published on November 10th in um, Bitcoin Magazine. In large part because it tells the story of the dollar through the 20th century and the implications of having the dollar be decoupled from gold and having it serve as fiat money and what its relationship is, as the title indicates, to our policy of endless war and militarism and imperialism in a way that was super clarifying for me. A history that I had never really thought about before in connection to this new debate. And as I said, this is a topic that is incredibly complex, but one way or another, it's something that you're going to have to confront. So I really appreciate your taking the time and helping everybody understand all of this a little better, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Glenn, for having me on.